Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all so much for giving us an hour out of your Tuesday. My name is Alec Ligon. I'm a transaction advisor here at Hinge. For those of you who may not be familiar with Hinge, we are a childcare specific advisory firm. What we do at its core is help you sell and plan your exit strategy for both your childcare business and real estate. We feel strongly that your exit strategy should start the day that you open your doors, and we want to be a resource for you throughout the entire life of your operation. For that reason, we've also added some success services that we will talk about a little bit later in the presentation here, in order to make sure that you are as valuable as far as your team is concerned, as far as your financials are concerned. We offer financial and QuickBooks training, mastermind groups for you and your staff, and then leadership sprints also to make sure that you're as valuable as you can be for when that day does come that you ultimately do decide to exit. Our proposed topic for today is how to run a successful sales process. We've chosen to have myself, Carrie Pergerson, our transaction manager, and Taylor Leaphart, a financial analyst on our team, to run this presentation because largely, other than the marketing team that we put in place, if you did decide you were ready to run a transaction with us, the core team that you would be working with would involve these three people. So myself, being the transaction advisor, would be your main point of contact throughout the entire process. We would help you step by step through everything from the initial phone call through closing with the new buyer. Carrie Pergerson, as the transaction manager, would be a main piece during the diligence portion once we are under contract or letter of intent with your new buyer, in order to gather the information that is necessary for them to get comfortable with the closing and ultimately get you the most bang for your buck. And then Taylor Leaphart works with you throughout the process at a couple of different points, namely in the beginning during an initial valuation, which we will discuss later on, and then defending your numbers in a quality of earnings review that we'll also touch on throughout the process. All right, so discussed a little bit of this earlier. So again, we do want to be a resource for you throughout the life of your operation. We want to make sure that we're giving you any information and pointers as we can to make sure you are as valuable as you can be. The first thing that kind of comes to mind there is running business valuations. We do these for free for everyone. Whether you're ready to sell right now or in 10 years, we can be a resource for you in order to not only give you the information that you need to know how much your business is worth, how much your real estate is worth, but also give you specifics as to areas we think you can improve on in order to make sure that bottom line is as rich as possible. We have dedicated in-house financial analysts, Taylor being one of them, who will be on this call today. We also run industry-specific and market-specific valuations. So why is this important? Not everyone who runs business valuations is familiar with the childcare industry. They don't know what specific buyers in this market are really looking for. They don't always understand the multiples that are associated and the things that we see in the day-to-day market running transactions solely in this industry. We have a huge list of active buyers, so 500 plus relationships that we've built over many, many years with operators throughout the industry who are interested in your schools. Does that mean we would market to all 500? No, absolutely not. Some of these are a combination of financial and strategic buyers that we'll touch on again later on. But we do have a large group and pool of buyers that we would ultimately market your schools to. We target each individual buyer based on your valuation, the price, your strategy, what you're looking for the new operator that's going to come in during a transition, and making sure that it's the right culture fit for you. What type of program do you run? What do your teachers look for in leadership? Are we making sure that the new buyer who's coming in is a right fit for your parents and staff? Because at the end of the day, right, it's not just who has the highest value on your schools, it's who's going to take care of your parents and staff when that day does come and you're ready to move on. We have a proven process resulting in 300 plus successfully closed transactions since 2003, 95% close rate. That actually would be much higher if not for the pandemic. And we have to do it this way, right? We have to be sure that we can perform for you, because at Hinge, we're not paid unless we perform. There are no fees throughout our entire process. We don't get paid until the closing table. So we get paid the same time you do. We take that journey with you. So we have to be mindful of that, and we have to understand from the beginning that we can get the job done for you. Otherwise, it won't make sense for us, and it certainly won't make sense for you. One of the notes that I pointed on earlier is our financial and QuickBooks training. Christine and team are fantastic. They have a new webinar coming up on Tuesday, September 26th from 12 to 2 with a 2-hour QuickBooks online training. Please, if you're interested in doing that, hit the link in our book here. It'll take you right through there. And this is a big piece for kind of getting the off the ground during our process. Aligning your QuickBooks with the way that we look at things, the way the industry looks at things is important. It'll serve you much better when the time does come and you're ready to sell. It also serve you in that we'll be able to advise you much more on the areas we feel like you can improve. So if you're interested in looking into that with Christine and team, they're fantastic. Please hit the link in the book here. And if for some reason you have issues there, please reach out to Hinge and we'll get you connected there. Also, please follow Hinge Advisors on social media. We got a great marketing team that puts together some really, really cool content. You'll know about webinars like this well in advance of when they come. Our great conferences, Shift and Thrive. Any cool Hinge news that's coming up, please do follow us on both Instagram and Facebook. Again, our marketing team is great, and it's really excellent content that they put forth. So give us a follow. All right, we're going to dive on into our process. So how did we get here, right? So you've decided you're ready to sell. Hopefully you've been working with us for years in order to make sure you're as valuable as you can possibly be. You're ready to retire. You're ready for a new venture. You call Hinge and you say, all right, guys, what are the first steps? So the first step is that we're going to connect you with an advisor like myself. So we have a group of advisors all across the country. We work in every state. And have worked in most every state. We would have an initial call with you to kind of talk through your goals, what you're looking for toward the future. And the first big step is that initial valuation step. Hopefully we've done this for you already and given you some tips. If not, that's okay. We can certainly start here. I'm going to kick it over to Taylor, our financial analyst that's going to be speaking with us today, to kind of run through this process and what it looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Alec. I think when we talk about evaluation and really starting to dive into what makes the sales process a successful one is a phrase that Carrie actually coined, and one I'm going to kind of steal here as we're kind of jumping into the pre-listing phase and evaluation, is understanding the process before the process. This is where you need to be able to intimately speak to not only the operations of your company, but also the financials of your company as well. So when we talk about evaluation, let's just look at it at a quick glance. What are we looking at? We start with a most recent 12-month of your financial statements. What we're looking for there, especially if we are able to have and obtain a month-over-month view, is any recent trends, current performance. Where is the overall business leading to? Are you growing? Are you showing a flat revenue growth? Really understanding what decisions and what managerial impact is being shown in this 12-month financials only kind of goes to the different steps that we're going to take going forward. So once we understand where the company's been, where it's going, especially in current performance, we want to start to look at the adjusted go forward EBITDA. Now, what does that mean? We want to identify any revenue or expenses that would only be attributed to the way that you operate the company. So in the event of a transition, what revenue streams or expenses will carry over to a new owner? In identifying those, we're able to extract value. And this is really where the art of valuation starts to come into, because this is a very gray area. And depending on how you've structured your company, how you manage your company, these adjustments can look very different over the course of over operations of your company. And once we've landed at a good adjusted EBITDA, we then apply a multiple. And applying the multiple is a very hot, everybody wants to talk about what's my multiple. And it really depends, especially on EBITDA, on size, on market, on the quality of your revenue stream, as well as the overall infrastructure that you built. So a lot of different factors go into applying this multiple. But once we landed a good assumption of value, that's when we loop the advisor back into my process. We have a quick discussion and then loop you back in so that we can all be on the same page as far as what next steps need to happen so that we can really start to realize that value, but also so that we can kick this journey off with you and start taking next steps.
Yeah, thank you, Taylor. And one thing I should have mentioned when we kicked off, if you do have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat as they come. We certainly want to address them as we're working through each page and each portion of the process. So we want to talk to you, not at you. So please feel free to shoot those questions out as they come through. So Taylor hit on some really interesting points. So as we mentioned before, it's important that you're running a process or at least getting a business valuation through industry specific experts, right? So that multiple, that business multiple that he's talking about, that's something that we understand based on the fact that we are solely in this industry. We understand what buyers are willing to pay at a certain EBITDA threshold for certain locations in certain markets. So it's important that you don't just use someone who runs business valuations. You use someone, whether it be Hinge or anybody else, use someone who has an understanding of childcare on the sales side and knows what buyers are looking for and can give you an actual valuation. Also, make sure you're getting a valuation before you sign anything with anyone, right? There are a lot of people out there who will probably just tell you, oh yeah, I can get you whatever you want. But you need an understanding of how they're going to get there before you ultimately tie yourselves to them. So this is something that we provide you early in the process before you're forced, to execute a listing agreement with us, before you, are saying, I want to go down this road with you. We provide this number for you and give you an explanation as to why we think that is what it is. One thing that I do want to mention at this stage, we actually don't name asking prices. So this valuation is strictly for you. This is for your internal knowledge only. And the reason that we stopped doing that, it was actually post-COVID, was that we wanted the market to set the value, right? In a lot of cases, if we had named an asking price that came out of this valuation stage, we may have left money on the table. So buyers are more aggressive in some circumstances than they otherwise would be due to many different things, mostly internal things with them. Whether or not they're looking, toward their exit plan in a few years, they're looking to be aggressive in certain markets, whatever it is, we want to make sure we're taking the best approach there for you and making sure that we're getting you the most value and we're letting the market dictate. So after this valuation stage, once Taylor and I have had an opportunity to discuss it, we've had an opportunity to talk through things with you, and you give us the green light to come and take a tour. The advisor would come and look at your facilities. This is really important, right? Especially as we're gearing towards a launch of your listing. It's important for us to have eyes on the school. It's important for us to be able to ask questions as to your specific operation. Again, we'd like to address your goals here. We'd like to see what the secret sauce is, if you will. We want to understand what it is that makes you so valuable and what we need to highlight during our marketing piece. We do these after hours or on weekends. We want to make sure we are not interrupting operation at all. We also want to make sure that confidentiality remains important. So the confidentiality is something that we take very, very seriously. It's something that we enforce into each buyer that we market to. We want to make sure that when the time comes for your staff and your parents to know that you're moving forward with an exit plan and that you're ultimately leaving them at some point, it's done the right way. So all tours, you'll notice throughout this conversation, would happen after hours or on weekends to make sure that those teachers who are there who really you can't get anything past aren't suspecting anything as far as the sale is concerned. After we've had an opportunity to come and tour your facilities, chat with you about your goals, and you ultimately decide you're ready to list, we would send you over a template listing agreement that we use on every deal. We can talk through the Hinge fee, what that looks like. I mentioned earlier, we don't get paid throughout a process. There are no fees to you throughout. The only fees that you would obtain are working through your CPA and your attorney once that time comes. But there is no fee to Hinge until the end of the process and until we close the deal for you. So we would negotiate closely with you and your attorney the listing agreement, and ultimately once that's executed, we can move towards the marketing piece. And here we are, marketing piece. So as I mentioned earlier, Hinge has a huge network of buyers that we work closely with, both strategic and financial. What does that mean? So strategic buyers are those who are currently in operation. They are your kinder cares, learning care groups, whoever of the world. Namely, we market to those bigger operators in order to get the most value for you. Those business multiples that Taylor mentioned earlier are much higher. Working with a buyer like that has great credit, that has a lot of resources, a lot of assets, and they can pay more than your typical 1 or 2 site group that you may be in competition with down the road. So our strategic buyer list is namely those larger groups of operators throughout the country. The financial buyers are mainly the private equity firms that own those schools, right? So these are the groups that are private equity firms looking to get into the industry, who are looking for that initial platform in order to start their childcare investment, if you will. So this isn't going to be an option for every listing. If you're a 1 to 2 site group, you likely aren't big enough to be considered a platform for financial buyers. If you're 5 plus, you may be. A lot of that is also EBITDA driven. So a lot of the private equity guys do have a certain minimum threshold they're looking to get as far as what they look for in a platform. But those are the types of buyers that we work with here. And here's a great question. So how do you calculate resale value for turnaround projects in good markets? Sorry, let me pull this back up one more time. So I think what the question is being asked is for those we are ramping. Is that right? So you're new, or you've purchased a center that maybe wasn't doing so well, and you're looking to boost or enroll in order to get the value up. So to answer your question, we would run well, Taylor, do you want to touch on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a really good question. I think this applies to 2 different scenarios. One, in this turnaround where you've recently bought a distressed property and are ramping back up the enrollment, kind of investing into the facilities, things of that nature. And a different scenario is pretty much a new build. You coming into a new facility and ramping up that enrollment. We take the same approach essentially. We want to look at the go forward EBITDA. And whenever we're talking about go forward in this scenario, we were talking about projections. So we were going to look at current trends. So try to look at that month over month growth as far as revenue and your enrollment, and then kind of extrapolate that out, given the seasonality of the childcare industry, understanding the nuances of the market, try to get to the best case scenarios. Either that might be a forward looking 12 months, or that may be just forward 6 months, just to get you to the completion of the year. But in both scenarios, we try to build a forecast around those metrics so that we can kind of extrapolate out what the growth looks like, what the mature value of your school would be if all the expenses and all your revenue streams are stabilized. So I hope that kind of answers your question. But for a turnaround project or any ramping scenario, we always try to project forward to get to a stabilized profitability rate.
Yeah, and I'll just piggyback on Taylor's comments there. Thank you, Taylor. If you are looking to go to market for a newly acquired distressed operation that you've acquired, or a new build, that is always an option. And as Taylor mentioned, we would value it based on future earnings and a projection, right? What that would look like in the form of offers from buyers is going to be a little bit different than if you had a fully ramped location and your value was sort of set. So typically the way that buyers would look at that is they're willing to pay you in the form of cash at closing based on what your value is now. And then in earnout structure, those can be run any number of ways. Typically that would be based on EBITDA, future growth as you continue to move. So they would also pay you on future earnings, typically over a 12-month period post-closing as the business continues to ramp. So don't feel as though, you've got to ramp everything to completion before you're ready to consider exiting your operation. There are ways that we can get you value for something that isn't completely ramped, if you will, if you do decide you want to go to market sooner rather than later. So hope that answers your question. If it doesn't, please feel free to follow up on that. Okay, so we touched on the specific buyers, both strategic and financial. Why is it important to have such an extensive group of buyer lists? So unfortunately, not all buyers are created the same, right? So at Hinge, we feel strongly about everyone we would recommend marketing to, right? We're not going to market to someone we don't feel can transition, take care of your people, isn't going to be a good fit for you, for whatever reason. But with that being said, not everyone's the same. Not everyone's process is the same. Not everyone's transitions look the same. Not everyone's operation is going to be the same. So once we do decide on what that list looks like, we sit down with you and talk through. So what would happen is the advisor, say it's myself in this circumstance, we would come up with a list of buyers that we recommend marketing to. We would send that list to you and sit down with you and say, all right, here's what you can expect from buyer A, here's what you can expect from B, C, and so forth. And then ultimately you would decide, okay, well, I like buyer A, but maybe they're not going to be the best fit for my operation because they don't run Montessori, because they don't work in my market, any number of reasons. Let's remove them from the list and focus solely on these other guys. So we had that conversation with you. We've worked with all of these buyers very closely, so we can have a very in-depth conversation with you about that. So we talked about this also earlier. What's attractive to each childcare buyer? The size of the listing, right? So generally, when you're strictly talking number of locations, 3 or more in any market is big enough for someone to come into a new location. If you're a 1 to 2 site group, that's okay, but we may want to focus more on people who are operating in and around your markets currently. That specific market, so being in and around larger cities is always important. And when I say in and around, I mean generally within about an hour's drive is typically what we look for. The type of transition I touched on earlier, some like to have a longer term transition, some like for you to assist in that transition. So these are specific conversations that we have with you once we start talking about the buyer list. The secret sauce that I touched on earlier, what are we going to highlight about your business that makes you special, right? What is it that's going to get you the most bang for your buck? When those offers start rolling in, we want to be able to highlight that. Is it a tenured staff that you had for decades? Is it a robust curriculum that you've helped create and kind of get off the ground? And what is it that your parents keep coming back for? What is it that makes you so special? And then business only or business in real estate. The buyers that we work with are pretty indifferent for the most part about whether or not you hold your own real estate. They will generally partner with a REIT company if you do decide you want to sell business and real estate. But largely speaking, if whether or not you own your own real estate, it doesn't really have much of an effect on who we would market to. So as we're talking through all these things, we're also creating the offering memorandum. So that's the large marketing package that we create and send out to potential buyers. We have a huge marketing team that has worked on these over many years, so we know exactly, especially after speaking with you, what we want to highlight, what we want to show, and what's important to each buyer. We do professional photography on every listing that we take on, unless of course you already have professional photos that we can use. That is a Hinge fee, not a fee that you incur working through the process. We do really cool drone footage that shows you the entire property, playgrounds, the roof, everything, the parking lot, really good stuff. We have professional photographers that we work with all across the country, so we handle that for you here. We talked about the operational highlights. That's the secret sauce that we mentioned before. And the last thing to know here, probably the most important thing, Hinge covers all the costs. So there are no fees to you throughout a process. This is important when you're figuring out who you're working with here, because there can be those fees from some firms throughout a process that aren't the case with Hinge. All right, and now we've made it to launch, right? So we put all this work into gathering all this information. We've created the offering memorandum. We've discussed with you who we're going to send to. You've given us the green light on this specific buyer list. What does that launch look like? So the advisor, me in this case, would send out what we call a teaser to each buyer that you've approved. Again, we want to make sure this remains confidential until everyone signs a non-disclosure agreement. So it's basically just a little bit of highlight into the type of listing that we have coming on market. We give them some EBITDA information, general market area. So let's say you are a 10 site group located in Atlanta. We would say the greater Atlanta market, running at a certain EBITDA threshold and revenues for the past 12 months at X. So it's just some general information to make sure that the buyers understand this is what's coming. Am I interested in this market? Am I interested in something this size? And they can decide whether or not they're interested from the jump. Most every buyer is going to say, yes, I'm absolutely interested. Send me the NDA. For those who don't know what an NDA, it's a non-disclosure agreement, which protects your, protects your information that we put into the marketing package. It also ensures that each buyer that sees the listing understands that they cannot have communication with anyone outside of their operation about this listing. So it protects you. Again, that confidentiality word that we keep throwing around is extremely important throughout the process. We want to make sure when the time comes that your parents and staff are hearing it from you and not some third-party source. So at Hinge, we negotiate these non-disclosure agreements for you. I am also our in-house counsel. I am happy to do this for you as part of our offering to you. I am also happy to work through your attorney if you'd like for them to be involved in this step too. We want to save you on legal fees, but we also want your attorney as involved as you want them to be during your process. So we have template non-disclosure agreements that we can share with you. We can share with your attorney. They can make any edits they want, and we'll certainly use that in your process versus a different one. Included in the marketing package is what we call an indication of interest, or IOI. So we will set a due date, generally 2 weeks after launch of the listing. And what is an indication of interest? So it's a step that we added post-COVID in order to make sure that we're adding an area for you to weed out potential buyers. It is a submission of range offers. So this wouldn't be an official offer. It would really just be their initial internal evaluation that they would perform based on the financials that we've given them in the marketing package in order to understand what their thoughts are without having seen the location yet. Once we receive IOIs, we would sit down with you again, similar to the way that we did when discussing the buyer list, and kind of talk through each one, what we like, what we maybe don't like, and you would decide who moves on to the next phase, which is the buyer tour phase. So touring, similar to the advisor tour we had in pre-listing, this is the buyer tour, right? So it always happens after hours or on weekends. Again, we want to make sure that unless it's your choice to do during operation, right? But we want to make sure everything remains confidential. Buyers are okay. They understand they don't want to interrupt operations. So they're happy to do this after hours or on weekends. I personally prefer weekends because we're able to not only be strapped for time as far as daylight is concerned, but we're able to generally cover more locations. If you have a 5+ site operation and you want to show them all the schools, it may be difficult to do that after hours. So generally speaking, I prefer to do weekend tours. It's an opportunity for each potential buyer to see the facilities, ask you questions about the operation, make sure that what you have is going to be a good fit for them. A Hinge advisor or transaction team member will be on every buyer tour with you. So this is not something that you have to do alone. You don't need to feel overwhelmed by the situation, even though it may sound overwhelming. We will be there with you every step of the way to make sure that you're comfortable and your questions are answered before we get to this stage. So The next step is going to be an LOI due date. So similar to the IOI, which were range offers and general valuations from potential buyers, this is the official LOI or letter of intent. After we've completed all the buyer tours, we generally give buyers about a week in order to put this together. It's Mayor, I think you can go into the next one. It's a non-binding agreement, similar to an IOI. And it's a pre-contractual document that sets the basic terms of the deal, right? So it's a meeting of the minds, is what I like to say, between both our side and the buyer side. It spells out the type of transaction we're running, whether this is strategic or whether it's an asset agreement, a stock purchase agreement, which we can touch on later, and kind of lays out the basic terms of the deal so that you're making the best decision for you. Similar to what we did in the last couple of steps, we would sit down with you, discuss each letter of intent that we received from a potential buyer, and what we like, what we don't like, and you would ultimately decide, okay, I want to start negotiations with this buyer here. I think they're a good fit for this purpose and that purpose. Also, obviously, their offer price is coming in a place that I'm comfortable with. Let's start here and negotiate their letter of intent first. Once we get to that stage, I think we're happy to do the negotiation for you in-house to save you on legal fees, but we do want your attorney to be involved as much as you want as well. So in conjunction with your attorney, in a lot of cases, we would negotiate that letter of intent and ultimately execute it once we can come to terms there. All right, so this next stage is fun. Our diligence guru, I like to call her Carrie Pergerson, is Queen Due Diligence. She's going to be your best friend during the probably most stressful portion of the process, which is great. And she hates that I say this about her section of the deal. But I'm going to kick it over to Carrie now to talk through due diligence.
Hey everyone. Alec always has a different mindset about diligence than I do. I like to think that once you get under LOI, it's like being engaged. Now we're on that final path. So I like to think about diligence as the road to closing. With diligence, I like to think about compartmentalizing. Think about like buckets. We'll go over these in greater detail, but we've got financials, which Taylor's going to dive into in just a little bit. Corporate and organizational documents, licensing and accreditation, legal, operations and curriculum, staff and HR, facilities and real estate, and then marketing and IT. So now we're going to dive into each one just a little bit to give you an idea. Before I start, just know that every buyer has a different diligence list. There's not a standard list. And so during the LOI phase, when you're receiving offers, your advisor will work with you not only to talk about the culture fit of different buyers, but also just what their process is like. If you're on a very tight time frame, that might also be one of the deciding factors to dictate who your buyer of choice is. Some buyers have quicker processes, they have smaller diligence lists. So that's part of the thought process on picking your final buyer. So when we're looking at buckets, financial, Taylor will go into this in greater detail because he will be working side by side with me, with you all the way to close on the financial, which involves the quality of earnings in most cases, as well as just continual updating of financials all the way to close. Corporate and organizational documents. This is an easy one. This is when you have started your company, you would have typically an article of incorporation, or based on your state, sometimes it's called an article of organization. If you have shareholders or had a partner, if you no longer have a partner, we have to have those separation agreements. So any type of organizational or corporate document you have on file, that would need to transfer over as part of diligence just to provide. And this is a key one. This came up post-COVID because now, Alec will probably touch on this during legal agreements. There's different types of legal agreements, type of transactions we can do, or I should say structures. So one of them includes a stock purchase. And with that, you have to include your tax ID confirmation letter from the IRS. Some people keep this on file. Some people, it's been 30 years, so they don't have it. That is something that you can get a copy of from the IRS. It just takes holding on the phone for a while, but it's just a key part just to confirm your correct tax ID number. Licensing and accreditation. everyone's going to have a childcare license. And then based on your state or your county or your district, some schools have business licenses, some have various health, sanitation permits, food handling permits. If you are not zoned appropriately for this, for the use of a school, then there would be a special use or a conditional use permit. So that would be needed. Licensing issues. What we can do is provide a link to your state's licensing site. But if you know of course, you're going to know of major incidences, it would be great to summarize those. Just to back up a little bit with diligence, I want you to think about diligence as being not an inquisition. They're not trying to find, only the bad things. It's basically you want to show your school in its best light and in its truthful light. If you were purchasing a school, you would need to know anything about that school operationally, historically, things that could come up legally. So with licensing issues, even though most of those can be accessed online, it's still good to provide a summary if there are some major incidences, because you can provide some color around what happened. Accreditation, just if you have any accreditation certificates or information about those. And then going back to legal again, this ties into some of licensing issues. If you've had any litigation history with staff or children, you want to provide that, any settlement statements and so forth. And also let them know if there could be any current litigation issues. Operations and curriculum. So with COVID, we all know that 2020 and a lot of 2021 just are not good representations of schools. So we still have to go back to 2019. If you try to have a system that allows you to go back to 2019 to show your enrollment by month, by age or classroom, that's perfect. But you know what? That's not always the case. One thing to keep in mind with any of this diligence is if you don't have it readily available, we're just going to have to make do. Sometimes we can help you create, try to put something together for historical enrollments. There are times when it's just not available. So know that with diligence, you provide what you have. We try not to have you create anything that you hadn't already created or used. And then there are just going to be times when you are not able to provide all information. And let me see, I think we had a question. Let's see. This will be something we'll probably address after diligence. I'll go ahead and put it out there so Alec can start thinking on it. But someone asked, do you also work supporting companies selling franchises? I'm in the process of franchising my daycare brand. So yes, we will address that.
Carrie, do you want me to address it?
Yeah, go ahead, Alec.
Okay. Yeah. So as Carrie mentioned, we do help exit strategies with franchises, both franchisors and franchisees. Generally speaking, if you are a franchisee, you are advantaged to sell outside of a franchise because generally all of those franchise fees would move to the bottom line with a new operator. We have worked and attempted to sell franchises to people looking to get into franchises, but we've been a little less successful there. But to answer your question, we have done both.
Alec, I don't know if you saw that there's one more follow-up to that.
Yeah, so the main thing is if you're a franchisee, we recommend that you loop in your franchisor as early as possible. A lot of times in your agreement, it would require that they have certain rights, whether that be a first right of refusal, whether that be how the transition occurs, what actually happens. If you're looking at bringing in a new franchisee, they have to give approval. So I would first of all recommend looping in the franchisor as early as you're comfortable. If you are a franchise group looking to sell outside of the franchise, I also recommend looping them in, once you have a buyer that you're interested in negotiating with, because again, they're going to have those specific rights that can hold up your deal. I also just like looping them in because they sort of, you kind of owe it to them, right? In a lot of cases that to work closely with them and make sure they understand that you're looking to exit the franchise. So I hope that answers your question. Largely speaking, the process is very similar, but I will say that the majority of the buyer pool that we work with, unless you're talking about a financial buyer, cannot operate a franchise. You know, the larger learning care group, KinderCares of the world can't operate a franchise. So you're typically more advantaged in selling outside of the franchise if you are a franchisee. If you're a franchisor, private equity firms are very interested in purchasing franchises at the moment if you're looking into selling an entire franchise. So I hope that answers your question. If not, please feel free to add on.
All right, jumping back in, before I move on to other operational items that are requested, many of our clients come to us after they've purchased smaller schools in their area. So think about this, if you're trying to grow your company before you try to exit your schools, when you're purchasing schools, you're going to want to think about these types of things. This doesn't mean you need to get every little thing that I'm talking about, but think forward in the future when you are ready to sell your schools. If you have historicals from schools that you've acquired, that will really help. Historicals with financials and with their enrollment, those are key. That's really all you would need to carry over, because the other things you're probably going to put in place from your schools, like handbooks and insurance and so forth. So speaking of handbooks, employee and parent handbooks are always needed. Insurance. So with insurance, they want to see PDFs, like you can have emailed to you, of your current policies, because they want to see what policy limits you have in place. They want to match those, if not improve upon them. And they also want to see what lines of coverage you have. Loss reports, these are very vital. This will show them for a 5-year period any insurance claims that have occurred. Oftentimes there are issues that are paid out by the insurance company that don't go to litigation. So those are going to be shown in your loss runs. Vendors. This is kind of always a pain point because it's hard. It's hard to remember all of the vendors that you work with. So this is going to be something that we will fill out a template to start with, and it'll build upon all the way to close, because there's inevitably going to be someone you've forgotten about. Maybe the guy that just comes once a year to pressure wash, or comes quarterly to put in pine straw. Those vendors who you don't see regularly, you'll just think of them all the way to close, most likely. But what is key with vendors is anyone you have a contract or a written agreement with, or even a handshake agreement, the buyer would want to know about those. Specifically the ones in writing, any contracts or agreements, they'll want to review those to see if they want to try to assume those contracts, or to see the terms and conditions to terminate those. Curriculum. Of course, they want to see all about your school. And with this whole diligence process, just think of it also as letting your school or schools shine. As I mentioned earlier, it's not an inquisition. It's about wanting to know how you best run your school so that when they take over, they can do that same type of job or better. So with your curriculum, they'll want to see examples, your school calendar with holidays provided, some sample classroom schedules, and then onto your staff. One question we get probably every transaction is, what's going to happen to my staff? Believe me, as you know, staffing is an issue. So they want to keep your staff. They want to know all about your staff so that they can either pay them what they're being paid now, if not more. They want to make sure if you're providing benefits, they provide the same benefits again, if not more. So what we would do is provide payroll. This would go back to 2019 if possible. For 2019, 2020, 21, we could just do a year end, even 2022. For the current year, it would be just by month or by pay period. Benefits, summary benefits, the cost for the school and for the employees, and current invoices. And then something I would work on with you is the staff roster. We would build that out. That would help with the transition. Facilities and real estate, pretty simple: floor plans, site plans, leases, if you lease your facility, or if you have a lease with your real estate entity, if you own your real estate. And then any prior inspection reports, we would provide those as well. And the last piece before Taylor takes over to talk about financials is just marketing and IT. If you have any examples of marketing, brochures or flyers, a copy of your logo, specifically a high resolution if possible. And then we would look at doing an inventory of what IT, many computers, iPads, laptops, etc. So Taylor, I'm going to send it over to you since we're zooming along in time.
Awesome. Thanks, Carrie. And now we're kind of jumping back, but before we hit Q of E, I want to talk about right after the valuation and we sign a listing agreement. One of my responsibilities, especially as we walk through this process toward an LOI, is to do a financial recheck, to really do a deep dive, to try to tick off as many of the due diligence items that we know are coming based off of our experience in going through this process, and really try to understand not only what we've seen on the P&L, but the back end of accounting as well. So we try to get down to the transaction detail, try to link up as much of verifying information as we can to support the valuation, even before we launch our OM and go to market. So now kind of fast forwarding a little bit, as we kind of look through the lens of what a Q of E is, knowing the due diligence that we did on the front end, we try to make this as smooth as possible because we want to do the work on the front end, knowing that and being confident of the information that we have to present that is valid and accurate. So what a Q of E is, and this will probably be one of the first hurdles and honestly one of the first pieces of due diligence that the buyer's team will try to kick off and move forward, is really the revision, or they have the ability to review all the numbers, and it's the buyer's turn to take a deep dive into the numbers. And as Carrie was pointing out, with all the information that we'll be presenting to the buyer's team, it's not an inquisition. They're not really trying to find the mistakes or what is wrong in any situation or any piece of information, but it's their time to validate, to look at their evaluation that they did on the front end, to look at the substantiating information, and to come to a conclusion of the amounts and sources of the earnings that they're seeing, so that we're all on the same page and that we're all singing from the same hymn book. The key areas that they will like to focus on, and the areas of focus that I put a lot of attention to, especially in that recheck phase, right after we decide that we are going to market, are revenues, particularly tuition and enrollment over the course of 2-3 years plus, going back to 2019, just to get a good comparison, payroll, rent, and then that adjusted EBITDA, especially considering those add backs. When it comes to payroll, it's just as much information as we can. We like to go ahead and have those payroll registers ready and linked into your financial statements as accurately as possible. Same thing with rent. We want to have gone over all of lease agreements, make sure that all of the CAM charges, any external contractual obligations pertaining to the facility or rent that may be come to play within your financials, make sure that we understand all of those components. And then the add backs and adjustments, understanding what transactions link up to the add backs that we are associating with this go forward EBITDA, making sure that we have enough information as far as personal records or receipts, invoices, things of that nature, that we can tie directly into the financials that we're presenting. The Q of E process is, I would say, probably 50% of the hurdle when it comes to due diligence. The buyer side, rightly so, likes to take a lot of time and understand the numbers before they get into other areas of due diligence. And as Carrie was mentioning earlier, depending on the buyer, there could be a lot of other contacts that we need to loop into this information, whether it be third-party consultants or other buyers might choose to do this in-house. The process is relatively the same. The amount of information varies, but the spirit of what they're trying to understand as far as the financials are concerned is the exact same. And it's pretty much my job to be the middleman and to make this process as smooth as possible, given the information that we've built in the meantime. So maybe we're gonna hit the next slide and we can keep this thing rolling.
Awesome. Thank you, Carrie and Taylor. Really appreciate it, guys. So the quality of earnings review and diligence run simultaneously, right? So we're not wasting time, going through one and then the other. We do this in conjunction, and I know it feels like a lot. It's a lot of information that the buyers request, and rightfully so. Like Taylor mentioned, if they're going to pay you millions of dollars for this operation, they want to make sure what we presented in the beginning is actually what the business is, how it's going to transition to them, and that they're paying for what they think they're paying for. So like Carrie mentioned, even though it may feel like a lot, it may feel like an audit in a lot of cases, and like they're coming at you, it's really just so that they can get an idea of what they're buying. And it's important that you have somebody in your corner, right? We can help you early in gathering this information so that it's not so much on your plate during this process. You're going to have a lot of other things you're thinking about at this stage. You're still going to be running your operation here. So this is just adding to all the things you're already doing. So the earlier you can loop Hinge into your process, the better, because we can set these things in motion even before we've entered a listing agreement with you, right? Like I mentioned at the beginning, at the top of this presentation, we want to be a resource throughout the life of your operation, and that starts the day you open your door. So it's never too early to contact us. Don't feel like you have to wait until you're ready to exit before you pick up the phone and call Hinge and ask for support. We want to be that resource, so please let us be. So once we've gone through due diligence with Carrie, Taylor's defended your numbers in a quality of earnings review, everything is what it seems. We can focus more on the actual purchase agreement. We would get the template purchase agreement during the due diligence phase in order to make sure we're working on things simultaneously. But this is the main contract, right? This is the actual, we've got the letter of intent, which is that meeting of the minds, but this is the contract that spells out all the details of the deal, how everything is going to run, and ultimately gets us to the closing table. This is really the only area in the process where I say your attorney absolutely needs to be involved. We've already spelled out the major parts of the deal in the letter of intent. Now let's get down to the minutia. Now let's get down to the nitty gritty and make sure we've got everything spelled out. So there's two types of agreements that we run. One is an asset purchase agreement. It's probably what you're most familiar with. They're buying the assets associated with the business. The other is a stock purchase agreement. These look very similar from a process standpoint, but they are different. So whereas they would be buying the assets of the business in one, they're buying the stock in the other. What is a stock purchase agreement? It's basically like they're buying the legal entity that holds the business, that owns the business, right? So it's basically a transfer of legal entity versus a transfer of assets. Hope that makes sense. Again, the process really looks the same. Where you're advantaged one way or the other could be from a tax standpoint. It's a good question for your CPA, whether or not you're more tax advantaged doing a stock sale versus an asset sale. The other areas with licensing that we're going to touch on here next. But in a lot of states, running a stock purchase agreement versus an asset purchase agreement will kind of speed up that relicensing step that you always have to do in an asset purchase agreement, but don't necessarily always have to do in a stock purchase agreement. It's very dependent on state, and we can kind of advise you as to what we've seen with each one. You guys know all licensing reps are different. You can ask the same, or you can ask two different reps in the same state the same question and get two totally different answers. So we don't pretend to be professionals or experts on licensing, but we can give you an idea as to what we've seen in specific states. Again, we work very closely with your attorney to make sure you're protected here and that what you're doing, what you're agreeing to is right for you. See, we had a couple of questions come in. Let me see what we got there. We are the franchisor. How do you work with franchise systems if we prefer keeping a location while the owner wants to exit? So interesting question. Again, due to the buyer base that we work with that I mentioned earlier, we cannot typically sell within a franchise, but we can work closely with your franchisee to sell outside of the franchise. I know as franchisor that may not be what you necessarily want to do, but if you are looking to allow a franchisee to exit your agreement with them, they are typically more valuable selling outside because, again, all of those franchise fees that are going to you as franchisor would move to the bottom line and ultimately give them a higher EBITDA number. Would boost the value. But we had worked with franchisees in order to sell outside the system, a little less, so within a system, because we don't typically do outreach to franchisees. Hope that answers your question. What is the EBITDA range multiplier for EBITDA you have seen? Does a multiplier change if it's a franchise location? So yeah, great question. It does change if you're a franchisor looking to sell a franchise. So franchises actually pull a much higher multiple, and this is the actual franchise, not a franchisee selling off to another franchisee. If you're a franchisor looking to sell a franchise, multipliers are a lot higher. If you're talking about specific multipliers on EBITDA, I can give you specifics if you want to reach out. Generally between 1 and 2 has a certain threshold, 2 to 5 has the next threshold, 5 to 7, so on and so forth. So your advantage to hit those certain EBITDA levels, because the multiplier does increase during each one. If you want to reach out, happy to give you those specific numbers. Okay, great question. So does liability follow in case you do stock purchase agreement? And the answer is, this is the reason that we didn't see many stock purchase agreements prior to closing, and it was that liability piece. So you would basically have to indemnify the new operator on all liabilities occurring prior to the closing date. So to answer your question, generally speaking, no. But the purchase agreement will spell out the indemnification and the liability for new operator versus old operator. All right, I think I've got very, very little time here. So I really want to touch on staff and parent announcements, because this is super important. I've talked about confidentiality throughout the process. We want to make sure that this is done the right way. Generally, the staff and parent announcement, we want to keep to as close to closing as possible. Most operators recommend doing it the week of. So if you were to say close on a Friday, which we generally do, you would have staff and parents announcements the Monday before. All of your staff would be able to have their questions answered. Generally, the new operator would be on site to work with them closely, transitioning. So once the initial shock wears off of, oh, you're leaving, the next question is, do I still have a job? So we want to make sure that we work closely with the new operator to ensure that your staff feels taken care of, and that your parents also have their questions answered, right? Is my kid going to still have their teacher? Is the curriculum changing? What does it look like now? Do things change? And largely speaking, none of that changes. The new operator always wants to keep your staff if they can. Staffing is difficult for everyone, and they recognize that the same as you. So, and they also recognize a lot of your parents are there because of your teachers. That's part of that secret sauce that we talked about. So so all of this is important, that this announcement is done the right way to ensure that your staff and parents feel a part of the transaction, and they also feel like they have some comfort in knowing that they're going to be taken care of when you do ultimately exit in after closing. Sorry, I had to rush through that really, really fast. I want to be able to answer any of your questions. We're coming down on the last minute here. Please feel free to, and I know we didn't leave very much time for any of these questions, and you guys probably do have some. We do want to be that resource for you. I want to answer specific questions that you may have as you consider your exit strategy. Again, we feel it's important that you start thinking about this the day you open your doors, right? So just because you may have a 5, 10, 30-year plan before you're looking to exit doesn't mean you shouldn't use us as a resource. We do this stuff for free in the front end. We want you to be valuable, and we want you to use us throughout the life of your schools, so that we're making sure you're as valuable as possible and that your process is as smooth as we possibly can make it. So thank you all so much for spending your time with us today. We really do appreciate it. Sorry again, we didn't have enough time for these questions, but please reach out to Hinge. We want to be a resource. My email, I believe, is in the presentation. If not, you can reach out to Hinge, and I will send out my cell phone number, email, whatever it is. Please feel free to reach out.